Hi, kids. As we start out our study of Chicago, the unit is Chicago in the 1920s, but really we got to go back a little bit earlier to learn about the city of Chicago and okay, how did it get to the 1920s, and then eventually we're going to talk about how did that end up giving us the city that we live so close to today. Um, so our first article that we are going to read is called Chicago, the City of Big Shoulders. Okay, so if you could, please follow along while I read. The beginning. Chicago began as a village, just like most other settlements in northern Illinois in 1833. Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sable built a cabin on Lake Michigan right where the Chicago River flowed into the lake. Du Sable was of African and European descent. The area was culturally diverse from its very beginnings. The Native Americans who lived in the area referred to DuSable's settlement as Chickagoo, meaning bad smell. They called it that because of the wild garlic that grew on the banks of the Chicago River and still does today. The village's name of Chicago grew from that Native American word. When DuSable built his cabin, Chicago was just another village in northern Illinois like Plano, Yorkville, or Aurora. It was located, though, in a spot that made it perfect for shipping goods from the west to the east coast and vice versa. Chicago began to grow faster than the other towns around them with the help of industry such as the Chicago stockyards, where cattle from the open range in the Old West were housed until they were slaughtered for meat for a hungry, growing America. The stockyards provided plenty of jobs for anyone seeking work, especially new immigrants to the USA who lacked the money to buy land when they got here. The first big immigrant group to come to Chicago was the Irish, who arrived in the 1850s. They settled mostly in the Bridgeport neighborhood, which still retains its Irish heritage 150 years later. In the late 1800s, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, such as Italians, Czechs, and Poles, came to Chicago to work at the stockyards and the industries that grew up around them. They also settled on the South Side near their jobs, while the Irish, Swedes, and Germans who arrived a generation earlier started to migrate to the North and West sides, where new, nicer housing was available and the area did not smell of animal waste. In the early 1900s, hundreds of thousands of African Americans made their way to Chicago to escape poverty and discrimination in the South with hopes for a better life in what became known as the Great Migration. They settled on the South Side, like most other new arrivals in the city. African Americans quickly found work in the stockyards and surrounding industries. They also encountered resistance and prejudice from the other relative newcomers who sought to protect their newly won political and economic gains in the city. Chicago shall rise again. After the Civil War, Chicago was a major American city. It had grown so fast, though, that its buildings were often cheaply built and made almost exclusively of wood. That mistake cost the city dearly when on October 8, 1871, a fire broke out on the property of Catherine O'Leary on the city's near west side. Chicago experienced a drought that previous summer, so the wood that made up almost every building was severely dried out. High winds from the southwest helped spread the fire toward the downtown area, igniting everything within its path. The blaze was so severe that it actually jumped the Chicago River and set the northern part of downtown on fire as well. When the blaze finally burned out, more than 4 miles of the downtown area from the near south side through the Loop and into the Gold Coast was destroyed. Virtually everything from Lake Michigan to where the Dan Ryan Expressway now sits burned to the ground. 300 died and over 100,000 were left homeless. Relief aid poured in from all over the country to provide temporary shelter and food. The city vowed to recover and become even better and stronger than it was before the Great Chicago Fire. The Water Tower, one of the only buildings in the downtown area to remain standing after the fire, became a symbol of the city's determination to survive and rise again. And there you see a picture of the Chicago Water Tower on the northern end of Michigan Avenue. The world comes to Chicago. After the fire, business and political leaders in Chicago were determined to prove their city deserved to be mentioned along with New York, London, and Paris as one of the great cities of the world. Many outside Chicago still viewed it as a dusty, dirty frontier outpost that had no place as a world-class location. Its importance as a shipping hub and center of industry was understood, but Chicago was not considered a city of culture and the arts. Chicago business leaders such as Marshall Field and Cyrus McCormick, inventor of the Reaper, vowed that Chicago would find a way to join that exclusive club. The chance came when Paris, France hosted a World's Fair in 1889. The fair was a huge hit, bringing in visitors from all over the world. The Paris Fair's centerpiece, a steel tower now called the Eiffel Tower, wowed spectators and made Paris perhaps the most recognizable city in the world. Americans began plans for a Chicago World's Fair of their own to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage to the New World. To Chicagoans, there could be only one place for the American fair. New Yorkers also wanted it, citing their place as America's largest city, which they thought was far more important than the claims of the second city, as they arrogantly dubbed Chicago. Chicago leaders talked about their city's importance in America so much that Charles Dana, editor of the New York Sun, labeled Chicago the Windy City, referring to all of the hot air that came from the cow town in Illinois. When Chicago banker Charles Gage raised several $1,000,000 in less than 24 hours to top New York's offer, the 1892 fair was awarded to Chicago. Architect Daniel Burnham was put in charge of the construction for the Chicago Columbian Exposition, as the World's Fair was now called. He created a small city on Chicago's south side surrounding Jackson Park that became known as the White City, since all of the buildings were painted white and the entire area was lit up at night. The Chicago Museum of Science and Industry now occupies the only remaining building from the exposition in Chicago's Hyde Park neighborhood. And there you see what would one day turn into the Museum of Science and Industry. That area around Jackson Park is also going to be the home of President Obama's new library and presidential center. And they're going to restore a lot of the park that you kind of see here to what it looked like back in 1893. The exposition opened up in April 1893, and over the next year drew 26 million visitors to the city. The White City had exactly the effect that its organizers hoped. Chicago became a world-class city as America entered the 20th century. And just the last thing here before we leave, when we talk about a World's Fair, a lot of us are familiar with the Sandwich Fair or Kendall County Fair. That's something that lasts 4 or 5 days. It's basically a week of people coming to the fair. Well, a World's Fair in those days, it lasted an entire year. So people came from all over the world to Chicago, and it drew so many visitors that people finally started to think of the city of Chicago as something other than a place where cattle got chopped up into steaks and hamburgers and stuff like that. Okay.